I sat in the front pew of the church, hands neatly folded in my lap, staring at the polished mahogany coffin resting at the altar. The weight of the silence was almost unbearable, yet it wasn't the absence of sound that made the air thick. It was the presence of something far heavier. My mother was inside that coffin, the woman who had been my greatest challenge, my lifelong test of worth. A woman I had spent every waking moment trying to impress, trying to show her that I was enough, that I mattered. And yet, even in death, she had made it painfully clear that I was never going to be good enough. The tears that pricked the edges of my vision were not for the grief I was supposed to feel. No, they were for something else. Something I had been searching for all my life but never quite reached. Closure. I had always imagined that when this day came, I would feel something more, perhaps sorrow or even a sense of peace. But now that she was gone, I realized that what I was truly grieving was the absence of something I had longed for my entire existence. Her approval. But there would be no last-minute affection, no whispered words of pride or love. This was the final goodbye, and it was as hollow as the years that came before it. To my right, Sophie, my sister, sat sniffling with dramatic flair, dabbing at her eyes with a lace-trimmed handkerchief, as though the very fabric could absorb her tears and the attention she so desperately sought. Sophie had always known how to command the room, even now in the somberest of settings. She leaned into her husband, David, who wrapped his arms around her like a safety net, making sure the world could see just how much of a perfect family they were. Sophie, of course, looked flawless, as always. Her designer black dress hugged her figure perfectly, and her blonde curls cascaded in graceful waves down her back, looking like a model straight out of a high-end magazine. Even in the quiet of a funeral, she was the center of attention. It was never enough for Sophie to simply exist. She needed everyone to see how effortlessly she excelled at being perfect. A sharp ache lodged itself in my throat as I forced myself to look away, my gaze wandering to the second row. Aunt Marlene and Uncle John sat there, stiff and silent, eyes purposely avoiding mine. The rest of the family, scattered throughout the church, did the same. They all knew. They had always known. The distance between us was as palpable as the polished wood of the pews that separated us. It wasn't just the silence. It was the way they all avoided my eyes, as though to meet my gaze would be to acknowledge a truth none of us dared speak aloud. I had prepared myself for this moment, for the coldness, for the stark reality of being overlooked once again. I had told myself it wouldn't matter, that I wouldn't care if, after everything, I was still the invisible one. But even after all the years of being passed over, nothing could have prepared me for the words that would follow the service, for the words I would hear from the lawyer's lips after everything had ended. The service had ended, and the air in the church felt colder, heavier somehow, as we all gathered in the lawyer's office. The old man adjusted his glasses, flipping through the pages of my mother's will with such a practiced calm that it almost made me sick. I had expected the usual formality, the rigid lines of business. But when the lawyer spoke, his words felt like a slap, sharp and cold. "I'm sorry, Emily," Mr. Holloway said, his voice low as he skimmed the page. "Your parents left everything to Sophie." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as I absorbed those words, though I did my best to remain still, to stay composed. The tightness in my chest wasn't grief, no, not anymore. This was something else, something far more visceral. It was the sting of betrayal, the truth that had been buried so deep that, even now, the weight of it took me by surprise. "Everything," I repeated, my voice surprisingly steady, as though the question was a simple one, though it felt anything but. Mr. Holloway hesitated before nodding. "Yes, your parents believed you were independent enough and didn't need financial support. Sophie, being a stay-at-home mother, required the assistance more." I clenched my fists, my nails digging into the fabric of my dress. There was Sophie, living in her grand house with a husband who made six figures, luxury cars parked in her driveway. Yet here I was, the one who worked my way through college, juggling 2 jobs, building a career with my own hands, and never once asking for a penny. Yet, in the eyes of our parents, I was somehow not in need. That was the moment the dam broke. Aunt Marlene muttered under her breath, the words barely a whisper. That's ridiculous. She was right, of course. But the words had little weight here. The betrayal was done. I didn't look at Sophie, but I could hear her. A soft, pitiful sob. The kind she had perfected over the years to make herself the focal point of any room. She leaned into David, her ever-supportive husband, her perfect image unshaken. She was the golden girl, after all. Even now, as my heart bled with the injustice of it all, she was effortlessly perfect. The lawyer cleared his throat awkwardly, his eyes flicking nervously between the two of us, but Sophie didn't seem fazed. In fact, she simply let out a sigh, as if this were all just another unfortunate burden she had to bear. I mean, it does make sense, she murmured, placing her hand over mine in what she likely thought was a comforting gesture. You've always been so independent, Emily. Mom and Dad just wanted to help me. The words stung, more than I cared to admit. I pulled my hand away, the urge to lash out there but tempered by years of practice. Years of being the overlooked daughter, the one who never mattered enough to anyone to truly fight for. But this time I wasn't going to just take it. You knew, didn't you? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, though the words hung in the air with the weight of 1,000 accusations. Sophie bit her lip, the telltale sign that she knew exactly what I was asking. They may have mentioned something before. And there it was, the truth so simple and ugly, rolling off her tongue like it was nothing. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rage against this injustice, to demand how, even after death, our parents had found a way to remind me that I was never enough, never their first choice. But then again, years of being the invisible one had taught me that anger would change nothing. Nothing would change. So instead, I smiled. A small, knowing smile. If they thought I was independent before, they had no idea what I was capable of now. I stood up, my movements smooth and deliberate. Thank you for your time, I said to Mr. Holloway, my voice calm, as though the ground beneath me wasn't crumbling to dust. But I won't be contesting the will. Sophie's face twisted in confusion, her brow furrowing as she looked at me. Wait, you're not mad? She asked, her tone one of utter disbelief, as if the idea of someone not falling apart over this was beyond her understanding. I gave her a long, measured look, tilting my head slightly as I did. Oh, Sophie, I murmured, stepping closer so only she could hear, the air between us crackling with the tension of years of silent battles. I don't need their money. For a moment, relief flashed across her face. She misread it entirely, thinking I was surrendering, that I had simply given up. But she was wrong. The battle had only just begun. I turned on my heel, walking toward the door, my head held high, my thoughts already racing ahead to the next step. What Sophie didn't know, and what nobody knew, was that I had already prepared my own final gift for our dear parents. And believe me, it would be unforgettable. Before I share what happened next, the moment that left an entire room of journalists in stunned silence, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you believe in, hit that like button, because this story is just getting started. As I sat there, the lawyer's words still hanging in the air, I couldn't help but be transported back in time. Back to when it all started. I remember being so small, clinging to my mother's skirt, my innocent voice calling out for attention. But no matter how hard I tried, I was always in the shadow of Sophie, who seemed to shine with an effortless brilliance that drew everyone's gaze. It was never about me. It was always about Sophie. I could picture it now. My parents beaming with pride at Sophie's dance recitals, hosting parties with big cakes shaped like ballet slippers, praising her for every little achievement. And there I was, watching from the sidelines, feeling like I was fading into the background. When I won the spelling bee in 3rd grade, my mother patted me on the head and told me to keep up the good work, as though it wasn't really anything special. But when Sophie turned 16, she received a brand new car wrapped in a big red bow. A shiny, perfect car, the kind you only saw in movies. Me? I got a second-hand bike, rusty at the edges, because you don't really go out much anyway, Emily. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that I didn't need their approval, that I could be successful on my own. But deep down, it always hurt. It wasn't the material things I craved. It was their attention, their love, their recognition. And I never seemed to get it. Sophie, on the other hand, was flawless in their eyes. Everything she did, no matter how small, was worthy of praise and adoration. She was the golden child, the one they would go to any lengths to protect. And I was the afterthought. Years passed, and nothing changed. Sophie glided through life, charming everyone around her, never lifting a finger to truly earn anything. And I worked hard. I worked through college with 2 part-time jobs. I built a life for myself from scratch, determined to make something of myself without relying on anyone. I even landed a stable job in finance, slowly but surely climbing the ladder while Sophie stayed in her bubble, surrounded by luxury and convenience. But no matter how much I achieved, it never seemed to be enough. The more I worked, the more the gap between Sophie and me seemed to widen. She had the life everyone envied, the perfect house, the perfect family, the perfect image. And I had a tiny apartment, a couple of friends who knew me for who I truly was, and a career that didn't make headlines. I didn't need the attention, I convinced myself, but still, I couldn't help but wonder why it always had to be this way. Why I had to work so hard while Sophie's every step was met with applause. I remember the last time I really thought about it. I was sitting in my tiny apartment one night, alone, the quiet hum of the city outside my window. My phone buzzed, just a message from Aunt Marlene. "Emily, what your parents did is disgusting. You deserve better. Don't let them get away with this." It was a reminder of everything I'd buried over the years. And that's when it hit me. No more. I was done being the invisible daughter, the one who always came second. The time for silent suffering was over. I had given my parents everything they wanted: hard work, independence, quiet compliance. But that wasn't enough for them. It had never been enough. And now, even in death, they had left me nothing. They had given Sophie everything. I couldn't change the past, but I could make sure that, for once, I got what I deserved. And so, there it was. The moment when everything finally came together. The years of sacrifice, of silently accepting my place, all led to this one point in time. I was done playing the background role. It was time to take control of my own story. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need their love. But I was going to get what was mine, whether they liked it or not. The weight of everything that had happened was starting to sink in, but it wasn't sadness I felt. It was a strange, quiet clarity. I had spent my entire life trying to earn something that was never going to be given to me. My parents' approval, their acknowledgement of my worth. And now, after all of it, after everything I had done, I was still nothing more than a footnote in their lives. But Sophie, with her perfect smile and her golden aura, was the one they always chose. The injustice of it all simmered inside me, and for the first time in my life, I realized something. I didn't need to fight for their love anymore. I didn't need their approval. What I needed was something they had never given me: respect. And that respect wasn't going to be handed to me, no. I was going to take it. The decision came swiftly, almost as if it had been waiting for me to wake up and acknowledge it. I wasn't going to contest the will in court. That would have been too easy, too obvious. I had something far more powerful in mind. I had spent years watching, waiting, learning how the world worked around me, quietly observing the mistakes of others. Now it was time to play my hand. I stood in front of the mirror later that night, the silence of my apartment pressing against me, and I couldn't help but smile. The game had changed. The rules were no longer dictated by anyone else. For once, I was in control. I knew what I had to do next. The phone buzzed on the counter, breaking my train of thought. Aunt Marlene. I'd always found her to be the only one who truly understood me, the only one who didn't treat me like a shadow. The message was simple, but the words were enough. "Emily, you need to fight this. Don't let them get away with it. You're worth so much more." I felt a surge of something. Was it anger? No. It was something more primal, something deeper. It was the feeling of finally seeing the truth clearly, like I had been walking in the dark for years and now the light had finally come on. I didn't need their money. I didn't need their approval. But I was done being invisible. I tapped the screen, my fingers trembling slightly as I typed. I won't contest the will, Aunt Marlene. I've got my own plans. I wasn't going to spend another second living under their shadow. I would build my own legacy, my own life, and if Sophie thought she could take everything from me without any consequences, then she was about to learn just how wrong she was. I thought of Sophie, sitting pretty in her mansion, surrounded by luxury she never earned. I thought of the years she had stolen from me, years of my life spent trying to compete with someone who had never needed to compete for anything. I wasn't angry anymore. No, I was calm. This was something bigger than anger. It was justice. And justice was going to come in my own way. The next day, I made the call. I found the right person to help me. Someone who could see this through without hesitation. A lawyer who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. I smiled to myself as I set everything in motion. This wasn't just about money or revenge. It was about showing Sophie, showing my parents, and showing myself that I had always been worthy. I had always been capable of more than they ever realized. And now it was time to make them see it. To make them understand that the world doesn't revolve around the ones who've always been handed everything. It was time for the underdog to rise, and I was going to make sure that when the dust settled, they would finally see me for who I really was. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that something wasn't quite right. The will had been read, the words had been spoken, and Sophie was walking away with everything. But there had to be more. There had to be something deeper that I hadn't uncovered yet. I wasn't one to accept the surface-level answers I was given, especially not when it involved my parents, my legacy, and everything I had worked so hard to achieve. I knew Sophie. I knew how far she would go to get what she wanted, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not this time. That's when I decided I had to go back to the house. Sophie's house now. It had been my childhood home, the place I had once hoped would be a sanctuary. But over the years, it had become a cage. The memories of it were haunting, both comforting and suffocating at once. But it was still my place. The house my parents had built, the one they had filled with false promises and unspoken favoritism. If there was anything I needed to find, it had to be there. So, I made up my mind to go back. Quietly, without drawing attention, without anyone knowing. This time, I wasn't just going to gather keepsakes. I was going to find the truth. I parked down the street, not wanting Sophie to see my car. I walked up the familiar path, each step bringing me closer to a place I thought I had left behind forever. When Sophie answered the door, her face lit up with surprise, but there was something fake about it. It wasn't real concern, not even a hint of sympathy. Just the usual mask she wore to make everything look perfect. She stepped aside without a second thought, as if letting me in was no more than a formality. "Emily, I wasn't expecting you," she said, her voice a little too sweet, a little too rehearsed. "I just need to pick up a few things," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Mom had some personal letters and keepsakes I'd like to have." She didn't hesitate, though I could see the flicker of annoyance in her eyes. She had always been the one who controlled everything. But now she was letting me in just a little. I walked past her and into the house, my heart pounding with anticipation. I had to focus. I couldn't afford to get distracted by the overwhelming flood of memories. There was something I had to find, and I couldn't leave until I did. I moved through the house slowly, trying not to let the weight of my past crush me. The living room, where I had sat alone as my parents doted on Sophie. The dining room, where I had endured countless meals, watching as Sophie received the praise I had always wanted. It was all still there, frozen in time. But it wasn't home anymore. It hadn't been for years. I needed to get to the study, the place where I had always felt closest to my father. If there was one room where things might be hidden, it was there. I pushed open the door to my father's study. The scent of old books and tobacco lingered in the air, a familiar comfort that reminded me of when I was a little girl, sitting on the floor while my father worked at his desk. I ran my fingers over the wood of the desk, tracing the grain, as if that might bring me closer to the past. But there was no time for nostalgia. I needed to find the truth, and I knew it could be buried somewhere in this room. It didn't take long before I found it. The file tucked in the back of the drawer, hidden beneath old papers and receipts. The original will. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I carefully pulled it out. My hands shook as I opened it, scanning the words. There it was. The clause. The one that Sophie had made sure to erase. The one that would have split everything between the two of us. My parents had intended for us to share everything equally. But Sophie had changed it. She had altered the will, taking it into her own hands, ensuring that I would walk away with nothing. My heart raced as I read the words over and over, the truth sinking in like a cold weight in my chest. It wasn't enough that she had everything. No, she had taken that too. She had made sure I would never get what was mine. I felt a rush of anger, but more than that, I felt a sick sense of betrayal. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about control, about Sophie's need to have everything, to be everything. And now I had the proof I needed. I turned, my breath shallow, and there she was, standing in the doorway, arms crossed, her face as calm and detached as ever. Sophie. She knew. She had known all along that I would find it. She had probably been waiting for this moment, when I would come back and uncover the truth. You weren't supposed to see that, she said, her voice eerily calm, almost bored, as if this was just another trivial detail in her perfect world. I stared at her, my mind racing, my emotions swirling. She didn't even look guilty. She didn't seem to care that she had lied, that she had stolen something that wasn't hers to take. She was so used to winning, to having everything handed to her, that this small, dirty secret was just another victory to her. But not to me. Mom and Dad always intended for me to have everything, Emily, she said, shrugging like it was no big deal. I just made sure their wishes were properly carried out. The words hit me like a slap in the face. She was shameless, and for a moment, I wanted to scream, to expose her for everything she was. But I didn't. No, I smiled instead. Thank you for your honesty, I said, my voice steady, my hand tightening around the will. I turned toward the door, my mind already shifting gears, already planning my next move. Sophie thought she had won. She thought she could control everything, even after death. But she was wrong. I didn't need to fight her. I didn't need to expose her lies to the world. No, I was going to do something far more satisfying. I was going to take back what was mine. Quietly, methodically, and with more power than Sophie could ever imagine. The game had just begun, and Sophie had made a very big mistake. I could feel the weight of the discovery pressing down on me, but I didn't let it consume me. Instead, I focused on the next step, what I could do with this newfound power. Sophie thought she had everything locked up, that no one could touch her golden life, but she was wrong. I wasn't going to play by the same rules they'd made. I would use the system, twist it in ways that she wouldn't even see coming. I needed leverage, and I knew exactly where to find it. Daniel, Sophie's husband, was the key. He had always been the silent partner in their perfect little world, never really part of the spotlight, always following Sophie's lead. But I knew that beneath the surface, he had to be feeling the same things I was. Sophie's manipulation wasn't just directed at me. It had been directed at him for years. She had played him just like she had played everyone else. And I wasn't going to waste this opportunity. I made my move carefully, reaching out to him with a simple text. He responded immediately, probably more curious than anything else. I arranged to meet him at a bar downtown, the kind that had low lighting and old, dusty shelves filled with forgotten liquor bottles. The kind of place where secrets could be exchanged without the risk of being overheard. When he walked in, his face was tense, unsure of what to expect. He had no idea what he was about to walk into. He looked at me with confusion, his brow furrowing as he took a seat across from me. "Mandy," he said, his voice laced with surprise. "What are you doing here?" I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know about the will," I said, my voice low and controlled. I could see his eyes flicker with something, surprise, fear, maybe even guilt. But he didn't speak. Instead, he just sat there, waiting for me to explain. I wasn't going to give him the luxury of time to think it through. The truth was out there, and it was time for him to face it. "I know Sophie changed it," I continued, leaning forward, making sure my words hit hard. I found the original version. Mom and Dad wanted to split everything evenly, Daniel. But Sophie made sure I'd get nothing. She took everything. He shifted in his seat, his face going pale. He rubbed his hand over his face, clearly processing what I had just told him. I wasn't sure if he was more surprised by the fact that I knew or by the fact that Sophie had done something so brazen. But I wasn't here to make him feel better. I was here to make him see that the only way out of this mess was through me. I took a breath, keeping my voice steady as I leaned closer. I'm not interested in money. I don't want Sophie's lifestyle, but I want her to pay for what she did. I want her to know that there are consequences, Daniel, and you can help me make that happen. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought he might push back, might accuse me of trying to manipulate him. But instead, he sighed, his shoulders sagging. I don't want to be a part of this, he muttered. I don't want to deal with Sophie's mess. But he wasn't looking at me when he said that. He was looking down, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. I could see the cracks starting to show. Sophie had controlled him for years, made him feel like the weak link in their relationship. She treated him like an accessory, a tool to enhance her perfect image. But I knew that deep down, Daniel wasn't the man Sophie thought he was. He just needed the right push. I pressed on, my voice softening just enough to make him think I was on his side. Listen, I'm not asking you to destroy her life. I'm asking you to help me expose the truth. Sophie's been lying, manipulating, and using everyone around her. You know it as well as I do. But the truth is, she's a fraud. And if you stand by while she gets away with it, you're no better than she is. He didn't say anything at first. The silence stretched out between us, heavy with the weight of his decision. And then, slowly, he nodded, the first sign of agreement. What do you want me to do? He asked, his voice low. I leaned back, allowing myself a small smile. This was it. I had him. Sophie had always thought she was untouchable, but now, for the first time in years, the tables were turning. She had underestimated me, and now, with Daniel on my side, I had everything I needed to bring her down. I pulled out my phone and showed him the evidence. Text messages, emails, everything I had gathered from Sophie's affair. Daniel's eyes widened as he looked through the messages. I could see the disbelief and the anger building within him, and I knew I had made the right choice in bringing him into this. He wasn't just another pawn in Sophie's game anymore. He was going to be the catalyst for her downfall. As he read through the messages, his face twisted with anger. She was doing this behind my back all along? His voice cracked slightly, and I saw the hurt in his eyes. But there was something else there, something darker. Something that made me know I had chosen the right person to help me. You deserve to know the truth, I said, my voice soft but firm. You deserve to see her for who she really is. And once you do, we'll make sure she pays. He met my eyes, and for a brief moment, I saw the man he could have been if Sophie hadn't drained him dry. Let's do it, he said, his voice steady now. I'm in. I stood up, feeling a rush of power flood through me. This was it. The game had changed, and Sophie had no idea what was coming. She thought she had the perfect life, the perfect family, the perfect image. But it was all about to unravel piece by piece. And I would be there watching it all fall apart. The pieces were finally falling into place, and the satisfaction I felt was almost overwhelming. The truth about Sophie's lies, her manipulations, and the twisted web she had woven around everyone was ready to be exposed. I knew exactly what needed to be done, and this time I wasn't going to hold back. I wasn't going to give her the luxury of a perfect life, the illusion she had built around herself. It was time to shatter her world, piece by piece. Daniel had given me everything I needed. Every text message, every email, every flirtatious conversation Sophie had tried so hard to hide. It was all there in black and white, the undeniable proof of her affair with a man named Jack. It was clear that Sophie had been playing both her husband and me all along, keeping everyone in the dark while she lived out her own little secret life. And now it was time for the world to know the truth. I spent the next few days compiling everything, putting together a digital file that contained every damning piece of evidence. It was almost too easy, as if Sophie had never even considered the possibility that someone might dig deeper into her perfect little world. She thought she was untouchable, that no one would ever question her immaculate image. But I wasn't like the others. I wasn't fooled by her charm or her polished exterior. I had always seen the cracks, the lies hidden just beneath the surface, and now those cracks were ready to burst wide open. The hardest part wasn't finding the proof, it was deciding what to do with it. I could have handed it to Daniel, had him confront Sophie, but that would have been too easy. No, I wanted to watch it unfold. I wanted to see Sophie's perfect world crumble before her eyes, to hear her scream when she realized that her lies could no longer protect her. So, I made the decision to send everything to the people who mattered most to her, the ones she had carefully cultivated over the years. Her friends, her social circle, the people who admired her from afar. I sent the affair details to the charity board she ran, to the other mothers in her exclusive mommy group, to the homeowners association that had always adored her. I made sure the emails went to the people who needed to know just how perfect her life really was, and how far she had gone to hide the truth. It was late when I hit send, my finger hovering over the button for a moment longer than necessary, savoring the anticipation. I knew that the moment I did, Sophie's world would begin to collapse. The perfect facade she had so carefully crafted would shatter into 1,000 pieces, and there would be no going back. I leaned back in my chair, my heart racing as I imagined the fallout. Sophie's life, built on lies and manipulation, was about to implode. She had always believed she could control everything. Her image, her relationships, her family, but she had underestimated me. She thought she was invincible. She thought she had won. But this was my moment. This was my revenge. The next morning, I woke up to an explosion of notifications. My phone was buzzing with messages, alerts, and news stories. Sophie's name was everywhere, on social media, in the gossip columns, even in local news. The affair had been exposed, and there was nowhere for her to hide. She tried to play it off at first, sending out messages to her friends, claiming it was a misunderstanding. But the evidence was too overwhelming. There was no way she could spin her way out of this one. The screenshots, the messages, the pictures, it was all there for everyone to see. The betrayal, the lies, the secret life she had tried so desperately to conceal. It was too much for her to deny. And then the calls started. Her friends, the ones who had always looked up to her, began to turn their backs. The charity board, where she had once reigned supreme, demanded her resignation. The other mothers, who had once adored her as the perfect role model, now whispered behind her back, casting judgment on her every move. It was beautiful, watching it all unravel. For the first time in years, Sophie wasn't the one in control. For the first time in years, I was the one who held the power. I didn't feel bad about it. Not even a little. Watching Sophie's world fall apart was the closure I had never received from my parents, from her, or from anyone else. This was the justice I had been denied for so long. This was me finally taking back what was mine. But as I sat there, watching the chaos unfold, something inside me shifted. The exhilaration of revenge slowly began to fade. This wasn't just about Sophie anymore, it was about me. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, my sense of self-worth. I wasn't the forgotten daughter anymore. I wasn't the afterthought. I was the one who had taken control, who had used the system to make sure that, for once, things went my way. As Sophie's perfect image crumbled, I couldn't help but feel a sense of liberation. This wasn't about vengeance for vengeance's sake. It was about the power to change my own story. I had been invisible for far too long, and now the world could see me for who I truly was. The one who had fought, who had struggled, who had finally risen above the shadows. And in that moment, I realized that revenge wasn't about watching someone else suffer. It was about reclaiming the life that had always been denied to me. The storm had already begun, but it wasn't enough. Sophie's reputation was in tatters, her perfect world disintegrating one piece at a time, but I wasn't done. I had started this, but I wasn't going to stop until the final blow landed, until Sophie had lost everything. There was still one more thing she thought she could hold on to, one last fortress in her seemingly flawless life. Her marriage, her family. It had always been her greatest achievement, the crown jewel of her perfect existence. Sophie had always prided herself on her marriage to Daniel, the image of the devoted wife and mother that she had paraded around for years. She had crafted this perfect narrative where she was the picture of loyalty and devotion, a woman with a loving husband, children, and an immaculate life. But as with everything else, it had been a lie. And now it was time for that lie to be exposed as well. I knew exactly how to strike. Daniel was the key. He had already seen the truth of Sophie's betrayal. Now, it was time for him to make the final move. I had already sent him the proof he needed to see Sophie for who she truly was. But it wasn't enough for him to just know. He needed to act. He needed to take control of his own life, to stop being a passive participant in Sophie's game. I reached out to him again, this time with a more direct approach. I knew he was at his breaking point, and I needed him to understand that now was the time to stop living in her shadow. He wasn't just a pawn in her story. He was the one who could change everything. It was his move now. We met again, this time in a quiet cafe on the edge of town. The kind of place where people could speak in hushed tones and know that no one would overhear. Daniel was already there when I arrived, his face a mixture of anger and confusion, his hands trembling slightly as he held his coffee. "Mandy," he said, his voice rough, like he hadn't slept in days. "What now?" I slid into the chair across from him, leaning in slightly. "It's time, Daniel," I said softly. "It's time for you to take back your life." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, as if he was trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. But there was no humor in my eyes. He could see that. This was real. "I don't know if I can," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can walk away from everything." I shook my head, my voice firm. "You can, Daniel. You need to. Sophie's made you feel like you're nothing. She's made you feel like you have no choices. But you do. You have the power to take back everything she's stolen from you. The kids, your dignity, your life. Don't let her control you anymore." His hands clenched into fists on the table, and for the first time, I saw it. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal that had been building up in him for years. He had been living under her thumb, pretending everything was fine, pretending that the perfect family was all he needed. But now the truth was too loud to ignore. "I want a divorce," Daniel said, his voice low but resolute. "And I want full custody of the kids." The words hit me like a rush of cold air. And for a moment, I didn't know what to say. This was it. The final piece of the puzzle was falling into place. Sophie's perfect life, her perfect marriage, the one thing she held over everyone, was about to be torn apart. I gave him a small nod, my heart racing with the realization that this was the end of her reign. "Good," I said quietly. "You're doing the right thing." Over the next few days, the fallout was swift and brutal. Sophie had never expected this. She had thought Daniel would always be the weak link, the one she could manipulate and control. But she had underestimated him, just like she had underestimated me. He filed for divorce, citing her affair as the reason, and he demanded full custody of their children. And when the divorce papers landed on Sophie's doorstep, I knew the end was near. I watched from a distance as she stood there, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. She opened the envelope with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the papers, the truth sinking in with each word. The perfect wife, the adoring mother, her whole image was about to crumble before her eyes. The very foundation of her carefully constructed life was gone in an instant. Her reaction was everything I had hoped for. Her shoulders sagged, her face twisted in anger and fear, and for the first time in years, Sophie wasn't in control. She had always been the one to dictate the narrative, to manipulate every situation to her advantage. But not anymore. Now she was exposed. Her lies had been laid bare, and there was no going back. But I wasn't done. Not yet. Later that evening, I sat at my computer, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Sophie's affair was public now, but I had one more card to play. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this with any dignity. No, I was going to make sure that everyone she had ever known knew the truth. I uploaded the evidence, screenshots, text messages, pictures. everything that would tear apart the facade she had spent years building. But I didn't send it to Daniel. No, I sent it to her entire social circle. Her closest friends, the people who had admired her from afar, the ones who had never suspected a thing. I wanted them to see what she really was. The next morning, Sophie's phone exploded with messages. Her friends called, demanding answers. The people who had once been her loyal followers now turned on her. The charity board she had once ruled with an iron fist asked her to step down. The other mothers at school whispered behind her back. Their opinions of her forever changed. Sophie's perfect world was crumbling. And this time, there was no one to pick up the pieces. I could almost hear her voice in my head, the panic and desperation as she tried to salvage what little was left. But it was too late. The truth had been exposed. She had lost everything. And for the first time, I felt no guilt, no remorse. This wasn't about ruining her life. It was about making sure that she could no longer hide behind her lies. It was about taking back what she had stolen from me. The past few weeks had shown me something I hadn't realized until now. I wasn't the forgotten daughter anymore. I wasn't the one left in the shadows. I was the one in control. As Sophie's perfect image disintegrated, I finally understood. This wasn't just revenge. This was liberation. As the days passed and Sophie's world continued to unravel, a strange sense of peace began to settle within me. The chaos I had set in motion was unfolding just as I had planned. Sophie, the queen of her own carefully crafted empire, was now a shadow of the woman she had once been. Her perfect marriage had crumbled, her reputation had been destroyed, and her life, built on lies and manipulation, was in tatters. And yet, as I watched it all fall apart, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only the quiet hum of finality. I had done it. I had finally taken control of the narrative. The years of bitterness, the anger that had fueled my every decision, all of it had led to this. But now that the dust was settling, I found myself wondering, what did it all really mean? Was this revenge? Or was it simply the end of an era? I sat alone in my apartment, the familiar silence wrapping around me like a cocoon. The chaos of the past few weeks felt distant now, almost surreal. I had been so focused on taking back what was mine, on exposing Sophie and showing the world that I was more than just the overlooked daughter, that I had forgotten to ask myself one simple question. What did I really want? It wasn't the money. I didn't need Sophie's wealth or my parents' approval. That had never been the goal. And as much as I had convinced myself that I was after justice, the truth was that this wasn't about them. It was about me. It was about reclaiming the life that had always been denied to me, about stepping out from the shadows and finally owning my own story. The phone buzzed, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was a message from Aunt Marlene. You know, your parents were wrong about you, she wrote. They always thought you didn't need them, that you were too strong, too independent. But the truth is, they needed you. They were terrified of what would happen if you ever realized your own power. Her words hung in the air, a strange mix of comfort and revelation. For the first time in my life, I understood what she meant. My parents had always believed that I was the strong one, the one who didn't need anyone to support me. But the truth was, they hadn't seen me. They hadn't understood that their lack of support had shaped me into the person I had become. It wasn't their rejection that had made me strong. It was the absence of their love. I smiled to myself, a weight lifting from my shoulders. The past no longer had power over me. The girl who had spent years chasing approval, chasing a love she would never receive, was gone. In her place was a woman who had nothing left to prove. I had fought for what I needed, and in the process, I had found the one thing I had been missing all along: myself. There was no anger now, no bitterness, only clarity. I wasn't the forgotten daughter. I wasn't the one who had been left behind. I was the one who had taken control of my own future, who had carved out a life for myself on my own terms. And for the first time, I felt truly free. The house was still there, the one my parents had left behind. It was mine now in every sense of the word. But even as I stood there, looking at the house that had once felt like a prison, I realized something else. This place had never been home to me. It had been a battlefield, a reminder of everything I had been denied. I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need to hold on to the remnants of a life that had never really belonged to me. I made the decision then. I would sell it. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about getting anything from my parents. It was about moving on. It was about starting fresh, leaving behind the past and everything it represented. I needed a clean slate, a place where I could build something of my own, something that was mine and mine alone. As the for sale sign went up in the front yard, I stood in the doorway and looked around one last time. There was no nostalgia, no longing, just a quiet acceptance. I had survived. I had thrived. And now, it was time to leave behind the ghosts of my past and step into a future that was all my own. The house was sold within weeks. The money didn't matter to me. It wasn't about what I could gain. It was about what I could leave behind. I didn't need the wealth. I didn't need the approval. I only needed the freedom to live my life the way I saw fit. Sophie's fall from grace had been swift and unforgiving, but I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel the need to gloat. She had done this to herself. She had believed she was untouchable, but I had shown her that no one is invincible, not even the ones who think they have it all. As I walked away from the past, I realized something else. Revenge had never been the point. It had been about proving to myself that I was worthy, not of their love or approval, but of my own. And in the end, that was all that mattered. For the first time in my life, I was no longer the forgotten daughter. I was Emily, the woman who had taken control, who had finally found her own path. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. As Emily settled into her new life, the chaos of the past months began to fade, but the quiet stillness that had replaced it left her with an unsettling feeling. She had won. She had taken back control. Yet, there was something missing. She stood in her new apartment, a space she had carefully chosen. Simple, yet full of potential. The walls were bare for now, but Emily liked it that way. The emptiness felt like a blank canvas, waiting to be filled with new memories, new experiences. She had let go of the past, but the future seemed so uncertain. The quiet hum of her solitude reminded her of all that she had lost, even as she had gained so much more. She had moved away from the house, the one that had once been a symbol of everything she could never have. The sale was completed quickly, as she had expected. The money didn't matter to her. It was the act of letting go that had felt liberating. She had stepped into a new chapter, but there was still so much left to uncover about who she really was without the weight of her past dragging her down. One evening, as she sat with a glass of wine in her hand, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Aunt Marlene. "I hope you're doing well, Emily. I know this is all still new, but I've been thinking a lot about you. There's something you should know." Emily frowned as she read the message. She had been distant from her family for so long that even a simple text felt heavy, laden with expectations. What could Aunt Marlene have to say now? But the curiosity tugged at her. She typed back, "What is it, Aunt?" The reply came almost immediately. "Sophie reached out to me. She wants to apologize. She said she's changed." The words hung in the air like an unexpected storm on the horizon. Sophie apologizing? After everything that had happened, after all the betrayal, the lies, the manipulation, she wanted to make amends? Emily couldn't quite process it. She set the phone down for a moment, trying to digest the idea. Had Sophie really changed? Or was this just another manipulation? Another attempt to claw her way back to her perfect world? Emily shook her head. No, this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she had worked so hard to reach. She was done being pulled back into that world of control and deceit. She had fought for freedom, for her own happiness, and it was hers to keep. But despite the resolve, a part of Emily hesitated. There was always that small part of her, the part that had once longed for Sophie's approval, the part that wondered if, somehow, this apology could finally bring peace, some closure. She realized she had to decide if she was going to accept or shut the door on her past entirely. Was she willing to let Sophie back in, even if only a little, or was the damage too deep? The next few days were filled with restless thoughts and quiet contemplation. Emily found herself caught between two worlds, the one she had left behind and the one she was building for herself. Her phone remained silent after that initial message, but the possibility of Sophie reaching out again loomed large in her mind. It wasn't until one afternoon, several days later, that Emily decided she needed to see for herself. Sophie had always been a master of words, a performer who could convince anyone of her perfection. But could she really change? Was there room for forgiveness, or had too much time passed, too many wounds opened, for any kind of reconciliation? Emily arranged to meet Sophie at a cafe, a neutral ground. She chose a quiet corner, away from prying eyes. She didn't know what to expect, but the uncertainty of it gnawed at her. Sophie arrived looking like she always did, flawless, composed, with a smile that almost felt rehearsed. "Emily?" Sophie said softly, her voice carrying a mixture of familiarity and something else, something she wasn't sure how to label. "I'm glad you agreed to meet me." Emily sat back, her arms crossed, her gaze sharp. "What do you want, Sophie? After everything, after all that's happened, why now?" Sophie's eyes flickered, but she held Emily's gaze. "I've had time to think. About everything. About how wrong I was. I didn't realize it at the time, but I've hurt you in ways that I can't take back. I was selfish and I'm sorry. I never meant for it to be like this." The words hung in the air, but Emily wasn't ready to soften. She'd heard these kinds of apologies before. Empty words meant to absolve someone of their guilt. She needed more than that. She needed to know that Sophie understood the depth of her actions, that she understood what she had taken from Emily, and what she could never give back. "Do you really think sorry is enough?" Emily asked, her voice low. "Do you think saying the words makes everything better?" Sophie winced at the accusation. "No, I don't. I just—" She stopped herself, as if trying to find the right words, but they seemed to escape her. "You took everything from me, Sophie," Emily continued, her voice now rising with emotion. "You made me feel invisible, like I was never enough. I fought for years, I struggled, I built something for myself. And you?" She stopped, taking a breath to steady herself. "You took it all." Sophie's face softened, her expression pained, but Emily wasn't finished. "But now," Emily said, her voice firmer, "I've learned something. I've learned that no one, not you, not anyone, can take what belongs to me. I'm not the forgotten daughter anymore. I'm not the one who needs your approval. I never did." Sophie's lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, but Emily wasn't going to wait for her. She was done listening to the same old excuses. She had built her own life, one where Sophie didn't get to dictate her worth anymore. "I've moved on, Sophie," Emily said quietly, "and I think it's time for you to move on too." For a moment, the cafe was silent, the weight of Emily's words settling between them. Sophie looked away, tears brimming in her eyes, but Emily could see it. This was the end of the road. There was nothing more to say. Sophie nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "I'm sorry, Emily. I never meant to hurt you." Emily looked at her, and for the first time in years, she felt no anger, no bitterness. Only a quiet understanding that sometimes people can change, but that doesn't mean you have to let them back into your life. "I know," Emily said softly, "but I'm done with the past. And I'm done with you." As she stood up and walked away, Emily felt something shift within her. She wasn't just walking away from Sophie. She was walking away from everything that had held her back for so long. She had given herself permission to be free. And now, there was nothing left but the open road ahead, full of endless possibilities. As Emily walked out of the cafe, a strange sense of liberation washed over her. The final chapter with Sophie had been closed, but it was more than just that. It was the closing of an entire era of her life, one where she had been defined by the shadows of others, by the expectations and manipulations that had controlled her for far too long. Now, for the first time, she was completely free. Free to write her own story, free to build a life that was entirely hers. The air outside felt different, fresher, as if the weight of years had finally been lifted. She hadn't realized how heavy it had been until she let it go. As she walked down the street, the city around her seemed to pulse with new energy. a new rhythm that matched her own. It wasn't that everything was perfect. It never was. But for the first time, she didn't feel the need to fix anything. She didn't need to be perfect. She just needed to be herself. Days turned into weeks, and Emily began to settle into her new life with a sense of ease she hadn't known before. She threw herself into work, yes, but she also made time for herself in ways she never had. She took walks in the park, spent weekends exploring the city, finding little pockets of joy in places she had once overlooked. She reconnected with old friends, the ones who had seen her for who she truly was, and she started to feel a sense of belonging that had been absent for so long. But there was something else, something that had been quietly stirring within her. A part of Emily that had always been buried beneath the weight of her family's expectations, her sister's superiority, and her own self-doubt. She realized that, while she had fought so hard for independence, she had also been searching for connection. True connection, not the kind that came from approval or validation, but the kind that came from being seen for who she really was. One day, while at a local bookstore, Emily ran into an old acquaintance from her college days. His name was Noah, and he had always been kind to her, even when she had kept her walls up. They had lost touch after graduation, but seeing him now felt like the universe had decided it was time for a new chapter in her personal life. They exchanged pleasantries, but what started as small talk quickly grew into something deeper. Noah had changed too. He had found his own path in the years since they last spoke, one that was full of its own struggles but also of growth. There was a quiet understanding between them, as if their lives had unfolded in parallel, both shaped by similar forces, but both now free to define their own futures. As they talked, Emily realized how much she had missed this real, authentic connection. It wasn't about impressing each other or trying to fit into some mold. It was simply about being present, sharing stories, and seeing each other for who they really were. And in that moment, Emily allowed herself to be open, to truly be seen, without the fear of being judged or discarded. Noah asked her out for coffee, and she agreed without hesitation. Felt right. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what the future might hold. She was ready to experience life on her own terms, and if that included someone like Noah, someone who saw her without the baggage of her past, then she was open to it. Their relationship blossomed slowly, at a pace that felt natural. Emily found herself smiling more, laughing at jokes she hadn't expected to find funny, sharing her thoughts with someone who genuinely cared. She had built a life for herself, one of independence and self-worth. But now, she was learning that connection could be just as valuable. It wasn't about losing herself in another person, but about building something together. Something where both people could be fully themselves without fear. Months passed, and Emily's world continued to shift. She had built a new life from the ground up, one filled with friends, work she loved, and now, a relationship that was grounded in trust and mutual respect. Sophie was still a part of her past, but Emily no longer felt the need to revisit it. She had found her own peace, and with it, the strength to move forward. And as Emily sat on a park bench one afternoon, watching the sunset with Noah by her side, she realized something profound. She had spent so many years fighting for a place in a world that had never truly seen her. But now, she was building her own world, one where she didn't have to prove her worth to anyone. She was enough just as she was. The past was a chapter she had closed, but it was no longer the story that defined her. It had been the catalyst for everything that had come after, the reason she had fought so hard for the life she had now. But the future was hers to create. And with every step she took, she knew she was writing the next chapter, one that was filled with the freedom, joy, and connection she had always deserved. For the first time in her life, Emily was finally living for herself. And that, she realized, was everything. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the park, Emily leaned her head against Noah's shoulder, feeling a quiet contentment that had eluded her for so long. The road she had walked, filled with betrayal, loss, and self-discovery, had finally led her to a place of peace. She had learned that freedom wasn't just about escaping the past. It was about embracing the future, taking control of her own destiny, and finding her own worth. For the first time in years, she was living a life that was truly hers, unburdened by anyone else's expectations. Emily had spent so much time searching for approval, seeking validation from the people who could never give it to her. But now, she realized that the only approval she needed was her own. She had learned to stand tall, to fight for herself, and to let go of what no longer served her. And in doing so, she had found the life she had always deserved. Looking out over the park with Noah by her side, Emily smiled. She didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready for whatever came next. And with that, she understood her story wasn't over. It was just beginning. If you've enjoyed this journey of self-discovery, resilience, and empowerment, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more stories that inspire and resonate with your own life experiences. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. Has your journey of self-empowerment been just as transformative? And don't forget to like this video if you believe in the power of taking control of your own destiny. Thank you for being part of this story, and I can't wait to share the next chapter with you.